The Arizona sun was a hammer on an anvil, and the land it beat down upon was a cruel, beautiful masterpiece of rock and thorn and endless sky. For 3 days the dust had not settled. It hung in the air, a tawny veil over the misery of the captured wagon train. What had begun as a journey of hope for a handful of families seeking a new start in the territory had ended here, in this barren scrape of canyon, as prisoners of a band of Chiricahua Apache. The warriors moved with a quiet efficiency that was more terrifying than any shouting, their faces impassive as they sorted through the pitiful remnants of the settlers' lives. A broken spinning wheel, a water-stained Bible, a child's porcelain doll with one eye cracked. He stood apart from the others, a man carved from the same flint as the surrounding hills. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with a stillness that seemed to draw the very light to him. His name was known in whispers from Tucson to Santa Fe, a melody of fear and grudging respect. Goyawe, the one who yawns. They called him that for his patience, a predator's calm before the strike. Now he watched the proceedings, his dark eyes missing nothing. He was a war chief, and the lines etched around his mouth and eyes spoke of winters spent in the high country and summers painted with the dust of conflict. His terms, delivered through a warrior who spoke a broken Spanish, were simple, brutal, and final. For the lives of the 23 captives, he demanded a ransom, weapons, ammunition, and the immediate withdrawal of the cavalry patrols from the eastern slopes of the Dragun Mountains. And he wanted an answer from the fort by the next sundown. If it did not come, he would begin killing the prisoners, one each hour until the moon was high. Among the huddled settlers, one figure did not cower. She stood at the edge of the group, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the war chief. She was not much more than a girl in years, but the hard journey and this fresh horror had sanded away any softness. Her clothes were men's trousers, worn thin at the knees, and a faded calico shirt. A hat, once fine, was now a crumpled thing shadowing her face, but it could not hide the fierce light in her eyes. She had been driving her family's small herd of horses west when the Apache found her, and she had fought like a wildcat until they bound her hands. They called her the Cowgirl, not with mockery, but with a faint note of observation. She had watched the chief, studied his manner, and in the pit of her stomach, a desperate plan had begun to coil. As the second day of waiting bled into a searing afternoon, a tension thicker than the dust settled over the canyon. The settlers' whispers had died, replaced by the dry rasp of breathing and the muffled sobs of a child. A cowgirl could see the calculation in the war chief's men. They were checking the edges of their knives, their glances at the prisoners growing colder, more speculative. Time was a rope fraying fast. The fort would not meet his terms. She knew it. Everyone knew it. The army did not bargain. It attacked. When the sunset came, the dying would begin. She could not let it. There was a little boy with her, her brother, his small hand clutching the frayed hem of her shirt. He had not spoken since the attack. She looked from his pale, terrified face to the implacable figure of Goyawe, standing before his tipi, a silhouette against the bloody sky. The courage that rose in her then was not the hot, reckless kind, but a cold, solid thing like a river stone. It was a decision. She stepped forward. The movement was small, but in the stagnant air, it was as shocking as a gunshot. A warrior moved to block her, but she did not look at him. Her eyes were locked on the chief. "Please!" Her voice cracked from disuse, but it carried. "Take me instead." The words hung in the air, absurd, monumental. The settlers gasped. One of the women tried to pull her back, but she shook off the hand. Goyawe turned his head slowly, as if noticing her for the first time. He said nothing, his expression unreadable. The interpreter stepped forward, but the chief raised a hand, silencing him. He understood. She swallowed, forcing the words out, making them clear. "You want a message the fort will understand. Killing these farmers will only make them send more soldiers. They will write them off as casualties, but a life held, a life bargained. It is different. Take me. Let 'em all go. I will stay. I will be your surety." Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but she kept her chin up, meeting his penetrating stare. She was offering herself as a hostage, a trade. One life for 23. For a long moment there was only the sound of the wind scraping across stone. The war chief's eyes traveled over her, not with the leering interest she had feared from some of the cavalrymen back at the last outpost, but with an appraising, almost clinical detachment. He saw the defiance, the weariness, the stubborn set of her shoulders. He saw a resource, not a woman. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, graveled, and though she did not know the words, their meaning was chillingly clear. The interpreter, his face carefully blank, translated. "The chief says you have the heart of a rider. He says you see the truth of the path ahead. He accepts your trade." A collective shudder went through the captives. Hope, ugly and desperate, flared in their eyes. The cowgirl felt the world tilt. She had not truly believed he would agree. The interpreter continued, his words dropping like stones. "The others will go at first light. You will remain. But a trade must be sealed. A pact must be witnessed." He hesitated, searching for the words. "His terms are for a night in his tipi. Then, when the sun is new, the others walk free, and you stay as the chief's surety until his true demands are met." The silence that followed was absolute. The meaning was not stated, but it flooded the space between them, a dark, understanding river. The women among the settlers stifled cries. The cowgirl's blood turned to ice, then to fire. This was not what she had meant. This was a deeper, more intimate vault of hell. She had offered her life, but not this. Not this slow unraveling of herself. She looked at her brother, his small face streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at the worn, hopeless faces of the people she had traveled with for months. Then her gaze found the war chief again. He was waiting. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no victory, only a stark, unforgiving reality. This was the way of things. Power dictated the terms. Survival required payment. His world was not one of gentle negotiations. A pact, to be binding, required a price that cut to the bone of both giver and receiver. The last of the sun's light bled out behind the mountains, plunging the canyon into a deep, violet gloom. Fires were lit, casting long, dancing shadows that made the warriors seem like spirits moving between the rocks. The settlers were given water, a small mercy that felt like a mockery. The cowgirl stood rooted to the spot, her bargain hanging around her neck like a millstone. She could take it back. She could stumble back into the huddle of the doomed. She could die with them in the morning, quickly, with a knife or a bullet. That seemed almost merciful now. But then she saw the war chief rise and walk toward his lodge. He paused at the entrance, a flap of painted buffalo hide, and without looking back, he spoke a single, quiet phrase. The interpreter approached her. His manner now held a strange, grudging pity. He says to come now. The night is for the pact. The morning is for life. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to scream her refusal to the uncaring stars. But her feet, as if moving through deep sand, carried her forward. The eyes of the captives were on her, a weight heavier than any chains. Some held pity, others a shameful, burning hope that she would see this through. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the tipi, on the figure of the man who now held not just her life, but the very essence of her in his hands. As she neared, the smells of the campwood smoke, hoarse, dried meat grew stronger. He held the flap open. Inside, the tipi was dark, save for the faint glow of a small central fire pit. She stopped at the threshold, the boundary between her world and his. This was the point of no return. Beyond this, nothing would be the same. The war chief's face was in shadow, the firelight catching the strong line of his jaw, the deep pools of his eyes. He was waiting. The entire canyon, the very night itself, seemed to be holding its breath. She lifted her foot, and with a final, silent goodbye to everything she had ever known, she stepped across the threshold and into the dark. The hide flap fell closed behind her, and the last thing she heard from the outside world was the distant, broken sound of her brother beginning to cry. The hide flap was not a door closing, but a world ending. The sounds of the camp outside, the soft murmur of the Apache language, the nicker of a horse, the crackle of the other fires became muffled, distant things. Inside, the air was still and warm, carrying the scent of smoked leather, sage, and something earthy and unfamiliar. The only light came from a few dull embers in the central fire pit, painting the interior walls of the tipi in shifting shades of copper and shadow. It felt smaller than she had imagined, yet larger too, a private universe ruled by the man who now stood silently on the far side of the dim space. He did not speak. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, kneeling to add a few slivers of dried wood to the embers. A tiny flame woke, licking upwards and throwing new, dancing light onto the objects around them, rolled sleeping mats of buffalo hide, a parfleche bag painted with geometric designs, a bow and a quiver of arrows leaning against the support poles. This was not just a shelter, it was a home, a place of order and purpose. The cowgirl remained frozen just inside the entrance, her hands clenched at her sides, her entire body a cord pulled tight enough to snap. She expected him to turn, to approach, to claim the price of their terrible bargain. Every story she had ever heard in saloons and trading posts about captives and savages screamed in her head. But he did none of those things. Instead, he sat back on his heels, his face now illuminated by the gentle fire. He was not looking at her with hunger or malice, but with an intense, contemplative scrutiny. It was the look a man might give a strange horse, assessing its spirit, its fear, its potential for breaking. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble in the confined space. He said a few words, then seemed to remember she did not understand. He gestured with a slow, deliberate hand toward a woven mat opposite him, near the fire. It was an invitation, not a command. The ordinariness of it was more disorienting than violence. Slowly, her limbs stiff with fear, she moved forward and sank onto the mat, tucking her legs beneath her. The ground was soft, covered in layers of hide. The warmth of the fledgling fire touched her face. They sat like that for a long time, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the soft hiss of the burning wood. He was giving her time to look, to see him not as a monster from a newspaper engraving, but as a man in his own home. His hair, black as a crow's wing, was loose around his shoulders. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, and around his neck hung a single pendant of polished turquoise set in silver. His hands, resting on his knees, were broad and marked with old scars. He was perhaps her father's age, but his eyes held the weight of a different, harder lifetime. "You are afraid," he said, and she jumped at the sound of the English words. They were heavily accented, rough, but perfectly clear. He had understood everything. She could only stare, her mouth dry. "You speak?" "A little," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I listen to the bluecoats. I listen to the Mexicans. To learn the words of your people is to see the path of their thoughts." He paused, feeding another sliver of wood to the flame. "You are afraid of the night." "Of the pact." She found her voice, a thin, brittle sound. "What kind of pact requires this?" "A true one," he answered simply. "Out there you offered your life. That is a thing of the spirit. It is easy to say. Here, in this place, you offer your peace, your safety. That is a thing of the body and the heart. It is harder to give. My word to let your people go is also a thing of the spirit. My warriors, they must see that my word is bound to something real. They must see the sacrifice. They must see your courage or your cowardice. Then they will believe the trade is strong." It was a logic from another world, ruthless and ceremonial. He was not talking about passion, but about power and perception. Her value as a hostage, it seemed, depended on her surviving this night with her spirit intact, on proving her own terrible bargain had weight. "So this is a test," she whispered. "Everything is a test," he replied. He reached for a waterskin hung from a tripod of poles, took a drink, and then, with a movement that was neither kind nor cruel, offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it. The water was cool and tasted of the skin. It was the first act of sharing, and it confused her more than any threat could have. "Why did you take us?" she asked, the question bursting from her. "We weren't soldiers. We weren't rich. We were just trying to get to the valley." He considered her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, not anger, but a profound, weary frustration. "Your wagons cut across the path of the deer my people hunt. Your horses drink from the springs that are ours in the dry time. Your soldiers follow the wagons, and then they stay. They build their forts of logs and stone. They say we must go to the reservation, a place with no game, with bad water. They say we must change, or they will kill us." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight carving deep lines into his face. "You ask why? You are the why." Every wagon, every plow, every fence is a promise of the end of my people. So I take what is on the path. Sometimes it is weapons from a cavalry patrol. Sometimes it is supplies. This time it is you, to make the bluecoats listen, to make them look at what they are doing. She listened, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a dawning, awful understanding. She had heard the talk at the fort, of course. The Apaches were thieves, murderers, a nuisance to be cleared. She had never heard anyone speak of deer paths or springs, or a way of life being erased. She had only seen the chaos and terror of the attack, not the long, slow provocation that led to it. Her father, before the fever took him, had hated the politicians and land speculators back east almost as much as he distrusted the army. They see the land, but they don't know it, he'd say. And a thing you don't know, you can't love, you can only use it up. She looked at the war chief, really looked at him, and saw not a faceless savage, but a man defending his home. It was a terrible, clarifying thought. What will happen to me? The question came out small. That depends on you, on them. He nodded toward the outside world. If the bluecoats are wise, they will talk. They will agree to leave the eastern slopes. Then you will be exchanged. You will go back, and if they aren't wise, he did not answer. The silence was answer enough. If the army attacked, she would be the first to die. Or perhaps something worse, kept as a symbol, a possession, dragged deeper into the mountains. The uncertainty was its own kind of prison. The boy, he said suddenly. The small one with your eyes? He is your brother? She nodded, a lump rising in her throat. You offered your life for his. That is a strong love. It is a love my people understand. A chief must have such a love for his people, to give himself for them. He studied her, and she felt seen in a way she never had before, as if he was looking past her clothes and her fear, down to the raw, deciding core of her. It is why I allowed the trade, not because it is wise in war, but because it is true. A strange, fragile connection seemed to thread the space between them, woven from shared recognition of sacrifice and responsibility. It was thin as a spider's silk and just as easily broken. Outside, the camp was settling into the deep quiet of the desert night. An owl called, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to hang in the air. The fire was burning steadily now, a small, defiant sun in the center of the dark. Then he moved. He stood up in one fluid motion. Her breath caught, the fragile moment shattering. He walked to the back of the tipi, to where his sleeping mat was laid out, and picked up a folded blanket of thick, striped wool. He brought it back and placed it beside her mat. The night is long. The desert is cold before the dawn. Sleep if you can. No harm will come to you from me this night. The pact is made. He then returned to his own place, lay down on his mat with his back to her, and pulled a hide over his shoulders. Just like that. The expectation of violence, of violation, dissolved into this bizarre, tense domesticity. He had given her his word, and for now, he was keeping it in the most literal way possible. The test, it seemed, was not of her body, but of her nerve. Could she exist here, in the intimate space of her enemy's home, and not break? Could she trust his word enough to close her eyes? She sat staring at his still form, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. The warmth was real. The safety, however, was an illusion as thin as the tipi wall. She was a prisoner, a pawn in a game between armies. His honor tonight did not change that. Somewhere beyond these mountains, a cavalry commander was deciding her fate over a map and a glass of whiskey. Her brother and the others would leave at first light, and she would be alone here, the nature of her captivity shifting into something unknown and prolonged. The war chief's terms had been met for this one night, but a new, more uncertain set of terms was waiting for the sunrise. She listened to his steady breathing, watched the firelight play on the painted symbols of the tipi figures of horses and mountains and suns. They were the story of his life, a story she was now trapped inside. She did not sleep. She watched the embers fade and waited for the dawn, wondering if the man who lay so still, who had spoken of love and sacrifice, would become her keeper, her killer, or something else she could not yet name. The longest night of her life had only just begun. The dawn came not with a sudden burst of light, but with a slow, gray leaching of the darkness from the hide walls of the tipi. The cowgirl had not slept. She had sat wrapped in the striped blanket, her back against a support pole, watching the war chief still form and listening to the gradual awakening of the camp outside. The sounds were domestic, ordinary, the soft voices of women, the crackle of new fires being kindled, the restless stirring of the horse herd picketed down in the wash. It was this normalcy that felt most alien. The terror of the raid had condensed into this thick, silent anxiety that sat in her chest like a stone. Goyawe stirred just as the first pale light outlined the smoke flap at the top of the tipi. He rose without ceremony, folded his hide covering, and stepped outside without a glance in her direction. It was as if she were a piece of his belongings, acknowledged and then forgotten for the moment. She heard his voice, calm and low, giving orders. The camp began to move with a new purpose. Through the gap in the flap, she saw the captured settlers being roused, given gourd cups of something to drink. Her eyes desperately sought and found her brother. He was standing, small and lost, looking around wildly. He was searching for her. Her heart clenched. She made to stand, to go to him, but a figure appeared in the entrance. It was not the war chief, but an older Apache woman with a deeply lined face and sharp, intelligent eyes. She carried a simple clay bowl and a piece of flatbread. She entered, placed the food before the cowgirl with an unsmiling but not unkind efficiency, and then pointed to the bowl, making a drinking motion. Then she stood back, her gaze appraising. She was studying the girl who had spent the night in the chief's lodge. There was curiosity in that look, and a hint of something else, perhaps pity or a grim understanding. The cowgirl ate without tasting, her attention fixed on the scene outside. The war chief was speaking to the interpreter, who then addressed the huddled settlers. She could not hear the words, but she saw the effect. A wave of desperate relief washed over them, followed by a surge of movement as they were gestured toward the mouth of the canyon, where a few of their own ragged mules stood waiting. They were being freed. Her bargain was being honored. Her brother was not moving. He was rooted to the spot, his small face turned toward the tipi, crying silently. A man next to him, the blacksmith from the wagon train, put a hand on his shoulder and tried to guide him away. The boy shook him off, his mouth opening in a wail she could now hear. It broke something inside her. She scrambled to her feet and burst out of the tipi into the cool morning air. All movement stopped. Warriors turned, their hands going to knives or rifle stocks. The war chief looked at her, his expression unreadable. She took a step toward her brother, then another, her eyes pleading with the chief. He gave a single, slow nod. She ran the last few steps and dropped to her knees in the dust, pulling her brother into a fierce hug. He clung to her, his small body shaking. "You have to go with them," she whispered into his hair, smelling sweat and childhood and fear. "You have to be brave. You have to tell them at the fort what happened. Tell them I'm here. Tell them to what? To negotiate? To attack?" She didn't know. "Tell them to remember me," she finished weakly. "I won't leave you," he sobbed. "You have to. It's the deal. You're safe now." "That's all that matters." She pried his arms from around her neck, holding him by his thin shoulders. She looked into his tear-filled eyes, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "You be the man of the family now. You get these people to the fort. You hear me?" He nodded, a shaky, miserable movement. She pulled him close again for one last, crushing moment, then stood up, pushing him gently toward the blacksmith. "Take him," she said, her voice raw. The man nodded, his own eyes glistening with emotion, and took the boy's hand. She turned her back then, unable to watch them leave. She walked back toward the tipi, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her, the settlers' gratitude and shame, the warriors' measured curiosity, the war chief's intense scrutiny. She stopped before him, her chin trembling but held high. "Thank you," she said, the words bitter and sweet on her tongue. He did not acknowledge her gratitude. His eyes were on the departing group, already filing out of the canyon. "Now we wait," he said. "Your blue-coat soldiers, they will see the people returned. They will know my word is good. They will know what I hold." He finally looked at her. "You are no longer a captive of the raid. You are a surety of the talk. Your life is tied to their choice. You understand this?" She understood. Her fate was no longer about a single night of terror. It was woven into the fragile, hostile diplomacy between two worlds. Her value had shifted. She was a symbol, a living message. The realization was colder than the morning air. The camp returned to its rhythms, but her place in it was undefined. The war chief left with a group of his men, riding out to scout the surrounding mesas. She was left in the company of the women and a few older warriors who remained as guards. The older woman who had brought her food, whose name she learned was Na-Kos, seemed to have been given charge of her. Na-Kos did not speak any English, but she communicated with sharp gestures and expressive eyes. She handed the cowgirl a water bag and pointed to a task helping to unearth a cache of mescal roots from a fire pit where they had been roasting slowly overnight. The work was simple, physical. The other Apache women watched her, their expressions guarded but not hostile. They were curious about this white girl who had traded herself, who had come out of the chief's tipi unharmed, who worked now with dirt-smudged hands and a distant, shattered look in her eyes. As she worked, her mind raced. She observed everything: the location of the horse herd, the number of warriors who remained, and the direction the war chief had ridden. The way the camp was laid out, with clear lines of sight to the canyon walls. She was a rancher's daughter. She understood terrain and the habits of men on horseback. A plan, desperate and half-formed, began to itch at the back of her mind. Not today, not tomorrow, but maybe if the army failed her. In the late afternoon, Goyawe returned. He spoke briefly with his men, his face grim. He had seen dust on the horizon, he told her later, but no movement from the fort, no messenger, no sign of talk. The silence from the soldiers was its own answer, a refusal to acknowledge his terms, to treat with him as an equal power. It was the response he had expected, but a shadow crossed his features nonetheless. The path of peace, it seemed, was closed. That evening she was given her own small space, a lean-to of brush near Na-Kos's wickiup, separate from the chief's lodge. Her status was clear. The pact of the single night was fulfilled, and she was now a distinct entity in the camp, a prisoner of war, not a temporary guest. As she sat by the communal fire, picking at a piece of venison, she felt the change. The warriors looked at her with less curiosity and more calculation. She was an asset. She was also a potential problem. One of the younger warriors, a man with a bold, restless energy, said something to the war chief, gesturing toward her. His tone was not respectful. Goyawe's reply was quiet, but it cut through the night air like a knife. The young man scowled and looked away. The cowgirl understood the tension. Some of the men saw her as a burden, a complication. They wanted to strike at the fort, not wait for a negotiation that would never come. Holding her was a strategy of patience, and not all were patient. Later, as she lay under her blanket in the lean-to, she heard the soft tread of moccasins. Goyawe stood at the entrance, a darker shadow against the night sky. "The young man," he said, his voice low so only she would hear. "He thinks we should use you differently, to draw the soldiers into a trap. He thinks the waiting makes us weak." A new kind of cold seeped into her bones. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think a trap would bring many soldiers. It would bring the big guns from the fort. It would burn the land and kill many of my people and many of yours. It would not save the springs or the deer paths. It would only bring more death." He paused. "But if the soldiers do not talk and do not attack, then I look weak to my own people. And a weak chief is no chief at all." He left her with that impossible equation. Her survival depended on the army negotiating, but the army would not negotiate. The war chief's authority depended on showing strength, but showing strength might mean sacrificing her to a trap or to the anger of his own men. She was a knot in the middle of a tightening rope, pulled from both sides. Days began to pass in a strange, suspended rhythm. She worked with the women, learning to grind mesquite beans into flour, to weave strands of yucca fiber. She listened, picking up a word here and there. She saw the way the community moved, the shared labor, the laughter of children that felt so out of place in her own reality. She saw the worry in Na-Kos's eyes as food supplies were checked, and the grim set of the warriors' jaws as they returned from scouting, reporting more cavalry patrols, closer now, but still holding back. The war chief spoke to her sometimes in the evenings, asking about her life before, about the world of the settlers. He was gathering information, she knew. But the conversations felt like something more, a testing of ideas, a mapping of an enemy's mind. In turn, she asked about the land, the names of the plants, the stories of the mountains. It was a fragile, silent bridge built in the space between them, a bridge that both knew could be burned at any moment by the men with rifles on the horizon, or by the restless young warrior who watched her with increasing resentment. 1 week after her brother had left, the tension snapped. A scout rode in at a gallop, his horse lathered. He spoke rapidly, pointing east. The war chief's face hardened into stone. He called his men together. The cowgirl, hauling water from the spring, stopped and watched. Nakos came and stood beside her, her hand resting on the girl's arm, a gesture that was neither comfort nor restraint, but a tether to the present moment. Goyawe walked over to her. "The soldiers are moving," he said flatly. "Not to talk, they form a line. They come for the canyon." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the end of the waiting. The path of talk was gone. Now there was only the path of war. "You will stay with Nakos. You will do what she says. What will you do?" She whispered, the water bag forgotten at her feet. He did not answer directly. He looked from her to the gathering warriors, to the young man who had argued for the trap, now smiling a sharp, fierce smile. The chief's own plan, whatever it had been, was being overtaken by events. The calculus of strength and patience had changed. He had a choice: meet the soldiers in a direct fight he could not win, or use the one advantage he had suddenly been given, the terrain, and the girl who knew the value of both life and sacrifice. He turned his dark, unreadable gaze back to her. "The test is over," he said. "Now we see what your people's word is worth." He strode away to join his men. Leaving her standing there, the distant rumble of cannon fire beginning to echo faintly through the canyon, like the first rolls of thunder before a storm that would wash away everything in its path. The rumble was not thunder. It was a sound the cowgirl had heard only once before, when the army passed near their homestead back in Texas, the deep, throaty cough of a mountain howitzer. It was a sound of deliberate, impersonal power, and it rolled through the canyon walls like a physical blow. The fragile rhythm of the Apache camp shattered. Women called to children, snatching up baskets and hides. Warriors, their faces now stripped of all expression except a focused intensity, checked their weapons and moved toward the horses. The air, which had held the sense of sage and smoke, now tasted of dust and dread. Nakas's grip on her arm tightened, not harshly but with an urgent insistence. The older woman's eyes were wide, scanning the high rock walls as if expecting soldiers to materialize from the stone itself. She spoke rapid, low words, pulling the cowgirl back from the open space near the spring toward the deeper recesses of the canyon where the wickiups were clustered. Their world, which had felt like an entire universe for the past days, had suddenly become a tiny, vulnerable pocket in a vast and hostile landscape. Goyawe stood amid the controlled chaos, a still point in the storm. The young warrior, the one who had argued for the trap, was at his side, speaking quickly, gesturing with a rifle toward the eastern mouth of the canyon. The war chief listened, his gaze lifted to the rim. The cowgirl knew what the young man was advocating, a swift, brutal ambush. Hit the soldiers as they funneled into the narrow entrance, then melt back into the rocks. It was a good tactic for a small, mobile band. But the cannon fire changed everything. The army was not sending a scouting party. They were bringing the fist. As Nakos pushed her into the relative shelter of a tall, spiny thicket of ocotillo, the cowgirl saw Goyawe make a decision. He barked a series of orders. Most of the women and children, led by a few older boys, began moving swiftly westward, deeper into the labyrinth of rocks and arroyos that led up into the dragoons. They were escaping, carrying what they could. But not all. A handful of warriors, including the restless young man, mounted up. They were not fleeing. They were preparing to ride out, to meet the threat, to buy time. And then his eyes found her. He left the group and strode toward the thicket. Nakos stepped slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that surprised the cowgirl. Goyawe spoke to the older woman, his words calm but final. Nakos hesitated, then nodded, her shoulders slumping with a resignation that was worse than fear. She turned and melted away after the other women, casting one last, inscrutable look back. The cowgirl was alone with the war chief. The sounds of the departing band faded, leaving an eerie quiet punctuated by the occasional, bone-shaking thud of the distant cannon. They were shelling the approaches, softening the land, a display of force meant to terrify. "They come for you?" Goyaway said, his voice devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "They come to kill you," she replied, the truth of it chilling her. "Yes," he knelt, picking up a dry twig and drawing a quick rough map in the dirt. "They are here. The big gun is with them. They will come into the canyon here, where it is wide. They think we will run or we will stand and fight here, in our camp." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "You know the soldier chief. What will he do?" She thought of the commander at the fort, a man with a waxed mustache and cold blue eyes who had looked at their wagon train as a nuisance. "He's proud. He doesn't like to be made to wait. He'll want to finish it quickly. To show his strength." She swallowed. "He'll push straight in. He'll want to find you." "To find me?" Goyaway studied the dirt map, then erased part of it with his hand. "The young men, they want to fight at the mouth. It is a good place to die with honor. It is not a good place to live." He looked up at her. "You offered your life once for your people. Would you offer your courage for a chance at life? For my people and for yourself?" The question hung in the air, more terrifying than any command. "What do you mean?" He stood. "I will not lead my young men into the cannon's mouth. We will not be here when the soldiers come. We will be there." He pointed to a high, sheer cliff that overlooked the canyon floor from the north side, a place where the canyon bent like an elbow. "We will watch. We will see what the soldier chief does. If he burns the empty camp and leaves, then we live to fight another day. You will come with us." He said it as if it were a simple, ongoing fact, a future of endless hiding, of being a perpetual hostage in a fading war. "And if he doesn't leave?" she asked, though she already knew. "If he searches, if he pursues, then he is a fool who walks into a trap, a different kind of trap." His gaze was relentless. "You will be the bait that is not eaten. You will be seen. You will draw them to the place I choose." Her mind reeled. He was asking her to actively betray the army coming to rescue her, to become a decoy, to trust that his aim was not slaughter, but a stunning, defensive blow that would force a negotiation from a position of shocking strength. It was a monstrous gamble. If the soldiers simply shot her, or if Goyaway's trap failed, she would be dead, and so would everyone in this canyon. Another cannon blast echoed, closer this time. The decision was not a weighing of loyalties, but a calculation of survival. The proud commander with the cold eyes would not negotiate. He would take her back, if she was lucky, and call it a victory, and the slow grinding away of Goyaway's people would continue. And the young Apache warrior with the hungry smile would get his wish for blood, one way or another. "What do I have to do?" Her voice was a dry whisper. A flicker of something respect, perhaps, passed through his eyes. "You stay with me? You do what I say? You show yourself when I say. You trust that my word to spare your life is stronger than their guns." It was the thinnest of reeds to cling to, but it was all she had. She gave a single, sharp nod. They moved quickly. He whistled a low, bird-like call, and 2 horses were brought, along with the young, resentful warrior whose name she learned was Kylie. Kylie looked at her with open contempt now, clearly disgusted that the chief's plan involved this white girl in any way beyond being a bargaining chip. Goyaway gave him terse orders. Kylie was to take a position with 2 others on the high cliff, with rifles. They were not to fire unless the soldiers fired first on the women's retreating party, or unless Goyaway gave the signal. It was a restraining order, and Kylie did not like it. Then Goyaway and the cowgirl mounted up. They did not ride toward the sound of the guns, nor away with the women. They rode upward, picking a treacherous path along a scree-covered slope that led to a high, hidden ledge overlooking the broadest part of the canyon floor, directly above the now abandoned camp. From here they could see everything, but they were virtually invisible, shielded by a jagged outcrop of rock. They settled in to wait. The sun climbed, baking the stone around them. The distant sounds of the army's approach grew clearer, the jingle of tack, the shouted commands, the grinding of wagon wheels carrying the cursed cannon. Then they appeared. A column of blue, a snake of men and horses winding into the canyon's mouth. They moved with cautious arrogance, rifles at the ready. The cowgirl's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the commander on a tall bay horse, his uniform a sharp contrast to the dusty earth tones of the land he invaded. She saw her brother's friend, the blacksmith, pointing toward the camp, talking urgently. They had guided the army here. The soldiers fanned out, surrounding the empty wickiups. A few men kicked over drying racks, poked through the cold fire pits. They found nothing. The commander's face, even from this distance, looked first puzzled, then furious. He had been denied his confrontation. He had been made to look a fool, marching his men and his big gun into a ghost camp. Then a soldier shouted. He had found something, the lean-to where she had slept, a hair ribbon she had lost. He held it up. The commander rode over, took it, and crumpled it in his gaunted hand. His head swiveled, scanning the canyon walls. He was making a choice. The proud man, denied his enemy, would not simply turn around. He would pursue. He would hunt. He pointed toward the western end of the canyon, where the narrow trail led deeper into the mountains. Where the women and children had gone, he barked an order. A contingent of soldiers began to form up to follow that trail. It was the worst possible outcome. They would run down the fleeing families. The trap Goyawe had mentioned would be sprung, but it would be a massacre of the most vulnerable. Goyawe, lying prone beside her, let out a slow breath. He turned his head and looked at her. It was time. His plan depended on a diversion, on giving the soldiers a more immediate, more tempting target. Her role was now, "Stand up," he said quietly. "Step out there, onto that rock, let them see you. Then turn and run back along the ledge, toward the pine grove. Do not look back. Just run." Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden. But she saw the soldiers beginning to move toward the western trail. She thought of Nakas, of the children. She thought of her own brother, safe because of a similar sacrifice. She pushed herself up on trembling legs. She took one step, then two, out from behind the outcrop into the full, glaring sunlight on the flat rock. For a second, she was a stark, solitary figure against the tan cliff face. A shout rose from the canyon floor. A dozen rifles snapped up, pointing at her. The commander wheeled his horse, his gaze locking onto hers across the vast space. Time seemed to stop. She saw the recognition dawn on his face, the prize. The reason for this whole campaign, right here, in the open? Then she turned and ran. The canyon erupted behind her. The commander's voice, magnified by the rocks, bellowed an order. "There, after her, now!" The focus of the entire company shifted in an instant. The pursuit of the women was forgotten. The bluecoats scrambled, a tide of men surging toward the base of her cliff, seeking a way up. A single, wild shot rang out, the bullet pinging off rock far to her left. She ran as she had never run before, her breath sawing in her chest, following the narrow ledge as it twisted along the cliff face. Goyawe was ahead of her, moving with the sure-footed grace of a mountain lion, leading the way. The sound of the soldiers' pursuit was a chaotic roar below and behind them. They were drawing the entire force into the narrow, broken ground of the canyon's northern rim, exactly where Goyawe wanted them. They reached a saddle of land dotted with juniper and pine, the entrance to a higher, tighter box canyon. Goyawe pulled her behind a thick tree. They could hear the soldiers crashing through the scrub below, their officers yelling, urging them on. The cowgirl bent double, gasping for air. She looked at Goyawe. His face was a mask of concentration, his ear cocked toward the sounds of the chase. He was waiting, listening for something specific. Then from high above on the opposite cliff came the sound he was waiting for, not a gunshot. A single, piercing whistle, the call of a red-tailed hawk, cutting through the din. It was Killy's signal. The soldiers were fully committed, strung out along the difficult approach. The women were clear. Goyawe met her eyes. The first part was done. The bait had been taken, now came the trap. He pointed silently upward to where the cliff walls leaned close together, a natural bottleneck. "Now we see," he whispered, his hand resting on the worn bone handle of his knife. "If your courage and my word are enough to turn back an army." Below them, the first of the blue-coated soldiers emerged from the scrub, their faces flushed with exertion and triumph, seeing their quarry seemingly cornered in the rocks ahead. They had no idea they were standing in the shadow of the cliff where 3 rifles were carefully, silently, taking aim. The world narrowed to the sound of boots on gravel and the harsh rasp of soldiers catching their breath. The cowgirl pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine Joyawe, a still shadow beside her. Below, the first soldiers fanned out, rifles scanning the rocks above, their eyes bright with the chase. They saw only a trapped girl and a single Apache. They did not see the 3 warriors, including Kylie, positioned like stone statues on the high cliff across the way, their rifles trained not on the men, but on the narrow strip of sky between the canyon walls. Goyawe did not reach for his own rifle. Instead, he stepped out from behind the tree, placing himself in full view on the open rock. He held his hands away from his body, empty. A soldier raised his weapon, but a sharp command from an officer stopped him. It was the commander, pushing his way to the front, his face slick with sweat and triumph. He looked from the war chief to the cowgirl, still hidden in the tree's shadow. "So," the commander called out, his voice echoing in the confined space, "the fox leaves his den. And you've brought back my property." His eyes settled on the cowgirl. "Step out here, girl." "It's over." Her legs felt like water, but a spark of defiance, fanned by weeks in this harsh land, flared. She was not his property. She stepped forward, standing beside Goyawe, not behind him. The commander's jaw tightened at the gesture. Goyawe spoke then, his voice calm and clear, carrying in the sudden quiet. "You have your woman. Now take your men and go. Leave this canyon." The commander let out a short, derisive laugh. "I am not in the habit of taking orders from a renegade. You are coming with me in irons. Your band will surrender, or they will be hunted down." He gestured, and a dozen rifles leveled at the war chief's chest. This was the moment. The trap was not one of bullets, but of choice. Goyawe had drawn the army here, away from the vulnerable, and into a position where the first shot would trigger a slaughter, but a slaughter of his own people, hidden and ready, firing down from above. He was offering a path without blood, if the commander was wise enough to take it. "Look up," Goyawe said, not raising his voice. The commander frowned, his eyes flicking upward. For a long moment he saw nothing but rock and sky. Then a glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, then another. He stiffened, his face draining of color as he realized his company was not the hunter here, but the prey, perfectly exposed in the kill box of the canyon. A low murmur of alarm spread through the soldiers as they, too, saw the ominous shapes above. "You are in a bad place," Goyawe stated simply. "My men, they are young, their fingers are eager. You can have your fight. You will kill me. You will kill her in the crossfire. You will kill many of my young men, but you will all die here today. Your big gun is useless in this narrow place. Or you can take her and go. Your victory is that you have her back. My victory is that my people live." That is the talk. The commander's pride warred with the tactical reality laid bare before him. He was a proud man, but not a foolish one. To order an attack now would be suicide for his command. And even if he won, the newspapers would call it a bloody massacre with heavy losses. Taking the girl back unharmed, however, could be spun as a successful rescue. He clenched his fists, his gaze burning into Goyawe. "If I see a single Apache after today, within 50 miles of this territory, I will burn every wiki up from here to the Mexican border." Goyawe gave a single slow nod. "We will be where you do not look." The standoff stretched, thick and silent. The cowgirl felt the tension humming in the air like a plucked wire. Finally, the commander snarled, "Fall back! Form on the canyon floor!" It was the most bitter order he had ever given. The soldiers, confused but obedient, began to retreat, casting nervous glances at the cliffs above. The commander turned his horse, then looked back at the cowgirl. "Come on, then." She did not move. She looked at Goyawe. The man who had been her captor, her enemy, and in the strangest twist of all, her unlikely partner in this desperate gamble. He had kept his word in every terrible particular. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw no victory, only a weary recognition. The fight was not over, only postponed. But for his people today, there would be life. "Go," he said softly, in his own language. Then, in English, "Your brother waits." That was the thread that pulled her. She took a step toward the soldiers, then turned back one last time. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling as inadequate as they were true. He said nothing more. He simply watched as she picked her way down the slope to where the commander waited, his expression stony. A soldier offered her a canteen, which she took. As the blue column reformed and began its slow, defeated march out of the canyon, she walked in its midst, but she did not feel like one of them. The dust of their passage was familiar, but the skin she lived in felt new and strangely raw. They did not speak to her on the long ride back to the fort. She was a symbol of a victory that tasted like ash. When the stockade walls came into view, a figure broke from the gates and came running. It was her brother. He crashed into her, nearly knocking her from the horse, his arms wrapped around her waist, sobbing. She slid down and held him, truly holding him for the first time since the world had ended. The blacksmith was there too, and the others from the wagon train, their faces etched with relief and a shared, unspoken trauma. In the days that followed, the commander gave his report. He spoke of a daring rescue, of a strategic withdrawal in the face of a superior enemy position. He did not speak of the trap or the bargain. The cowgirl was asked only a few questions, which she answered with short, simple truths. Yes, she was unharmed. No, she had not been mistreated. The officers seemed disinclined to dig deeper, content with the official story. Her own story, of a night in a tipi that was not what anyone assumed, of a shared understanding over a fire, of a terrifying alliance on a cliffside, had no place in their records. The wagon train families, what was left of them, decided to turn back east. The frontier had taken too much, but the cowgirl and her brother had nothing to go back to. With the little money left from her father's herd, she leased a small patch of land near the fort, not to farm, but to run a few head of horses. It was hard, lonely work, and the looks from the townspeople were a mix of curiosity and pity. They saw a damaged girl, a curiosity from an Apache camp. She did not try to explain. Some truths were too complicated for words. Sometimes, at night, she would look toward the dark bulk of the Dragoon Mountains. She wondered if Goyawe and his people had found their springs, their deer paths. She wondered if Killy's restless anger had found an outlet, or if the war chief's patient wisdom still held. One afternoon, almost a year later, she was mending a fence line when she saw a rider on the distant ridge. He was too far to see clearly, just a silhouette against the sun. He sat motionless for a long time, watching. She stood straight, shielding her eyes, her heart pounding a strange, slow rhythm. The rider did not wave, did not signal. After several minutes, he simply turned his horse and melted back into the landscape, becoming one with the rock and shadow. She never saw him again. But the sighting was not a threat. It felt, in some deep and wordless way, like an acknowledgement. A check on a pact that had been honored by both sides. They were living where the other did not look, just as he had said. Life moved on in its stubborn way. Her brother grew taller, his nightmares fading, her small herd grew. The fort buzzed with talk of new campaigns, new enemies, new lands to be tamed. She listened, but her heart was no longer in that conversation. She had learned the shape of a different truth, one carved not by conquest, but by survival, and by the fragile, fierce bonds that can form even in the hardest ground. She had gone into the canyon as a girl, pleading for a life. She had come out as something else, a woman who knew the price of a life and the unexpected places where honor could be found. The desert sun continued to beat down, the land endured, and under its vast, unforgiving sky, she built a peace, not from forgetting, but from understanding what she had seen.